At times, leaders must do more than strive for incremental improvement within their organizations. They must achieve breakthrough thinking. Every leader has to foster an environment conducive to creativity and innovation within their organizations. We're going to take a look at that issue of creativity and innovation in the next two lectures. We'll ask a series of questions in this lecture around the topic of creativity. How do leaders stimulate it within their organizations? What are some popular myths about creativity? In what ways is creativity a collaborative endeavor? And lastly, we'll ask a series of interesting questions around whether there might be a dark side to creativity and whether creativity might flag as someone ages. Creativity is an essential dimension of leadership. It's interesting to note its absence in many companies and industries. Harvard marketing professor Youngme Moon has written a groundbreaking and thought-provoking book called Different: Escaping the Competitive Herd. She argues in that book that far too many companies engage in what she calls herd behavior, where they're lavishly imitating one another rather than finding a different way. To develop that truly differentiated strategy, products that actually stand out in the marketplace, to change a firm's entire business model so as to really be able to distinguish what you do from what rivals do, requires creativity. But how do most companies go about thinking about their own products and services relative to the competition? Well, she points out that we always benchmark ourselves against other institutions and organizations. We look at our attributes and we compare them to a competitor's attributes. So we might find that in certain cases we're relatively equal to our rivals on a variety of dimensions. Then we may discover a particular attribute where we're doing quite a bit better than our rival, and we sort of pat ourselves on the back. And lastly, we may find some attributes of our products or services where we are behind the competition by quite a bit. How do we react to that type of analysis in most organizations? Well, Youngme Moon points out that most of our attention goes to our deficiencies. We focus on where we're behind, and in that benchmarking analysis, we try to find out how to catch up, how to bring ourselves to par with our competition. Yet she points out that if every organization is doing this type of benchmarking analysis, and everyone is trying to catch up on the attributes that are behind their rivals, then what we end up with is a gradual homogenization of the marketplace, where everyone becomes more and more alike. Instead, she would argue that to be truly creative and differentiated, what we really ought to do is amplify those attributes where we're already ahead of the competition, to strive to stay even further ahead and to distinguish ourselves. Yet instead, we're always playing catch-up, and in a way that's leading to more and more imitation in the marketplace, herd behavior, and homogeneity. She in fact talks about these paths of convergence that lead us to what she calls heterogeneous homogeneity. If you think about walking down a supermarket aisle, she argues that if you look at many product categories in that aisle, you see a sea of differences in the sense that there are lots of different brands and products, and yet in many ways it's quite homogeneous. One example for her is the bottled water aisle. Many, many different brands, many different flavors of bottled water, many different shapes and sizes to the bottles. It's the same, at the end of the day, it's all water, right? And most people can't even distinguish it from tap water. So it's a heterogeneous set of offerings, yet in a way it's remarkably homogeneous. And she argues that firms engage in this path toward homogeneity because they're constantly trying to engage in augmentation of their existing products, either by adding to existing product benefits and features, new and improved Tide laundry detergent, or by sort of multiplying the versions of the product. Diet Coke with lime, Diet Coke with lemon, caffeine-free Diet Coke, many, many different varieties of the same basic product. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with trying to improve products or offer different types of a particular product. But what she points out is these growth strategies tend to be expensive routes to commoditization, to having a sea of homogeneity in the supermarket aisle. She's calling out for more creativity, for ways that brands can find to stand out in the marketplace. Other authors have made similar arguments. Kim and Mauborgne wrote a famous book called Blue Ocean Strategy in the past decade, one of the best-selling business books of the last 10 years. And in that Blue Ocean Strategy book, they talk about how most firms tend to compete in the marketplace. They battle head-to-head with their direct rivals in what they call a red ocean strategy, where they're simply trying to steal customers from the competition. They're engaging in head-to-head battle over market share. They argue that more firms ought to consider a path toward blue ocean strategy, where they're being creative and innovative so as to find and create uncontested market space. One of their examples is a company called Cirque du Soleil. Cirque du Soleil is neither a traditional circus, nor is it a traditional Broadway show or other type of entertainment. It sits somewhere between a show and a circus. It's an entirely new, relatively uncontested market space, an entire new category of products and services that they're offering to the world, and it's attracted a great number of customers. And Cirque du Soleil has been remarkably successful over many years. It's a blue ocean strategy, they argue. So both Youngme Moon and the authors of this book on blue oceans are arguing that we need to instill more creativity in the way we set strategy and the way we develop new products in companies. That fundamentally, discovering blue oceans and avoiding homogenization is a creative endeavor. You have to be able to break out of your conventional mindset in your industry and in your company. Unfortunately, that's hard for many of us to do, and in part it's because we hold many myths about what actually drives creativity. Teresa Amabile is one of the world experts on creativity. She was an advisor to me when I was writing my dissertation many years ago. She's a fabulous scholar and teacher, and over the past decade or two, she did an amazing study to examine creativity in the workplace. Rather than simply conducting experiments with students on a campus, she actually collected nearly 12,000 daily journal entries from 238 people working on creative projects in 7 companies in multiple industries around the world. Each day, by email, people were reporting to her and to her team of researchers about their work and the environment within their organization. She then coded these emails by looking for moments when people were struggling with an issue or a problem and were able to come up with a new idea. This diary study was designed to look at creativity in the wild, she says. We wanted to crawl inside people's heads and understand the features of their work environment, as well as the experiences and thought processes that lead to creative breakthroughs. This was remarkably innovative because most studies of creativity have been in the lab. And here she was out understanding these moments of creativity in the daily life of workers in lots of different organizations. And through that work, up close and personal with creativity in the workplace, she discovered that we hold many myths that she was able to dispel through this research. Myth number 1 is that creativity comes from creative types. Back to personality again, something we talked about early in this series on leadership. Research, in fact, shows that you don't need to be incredibly intelligent to be creative. In fact, she said normal intelligence seems to be enough. And many people are not seen as creative, but in fact, it's their work environment that stifles their creativity, not their personality or their intelligence. Environments are crucial, and leaders, of course, can shape and foster environments where creativity can flourish, or they can create environments that dampen the likelihood that people will come forward with insightful new ideas. So environment's crucial, and yet we think often about individuals, about getting the right type of people in order to drive creativity. When as leaders, perhaps more of our attention should be focused not on hiring the right people so much as what we do once they're there to make sure that they have an environment where they can flourish. Second myth, that money is a creativity motivator. That if we get the right financial incentives, the right carrots and maybe the right sticks, that we can actually drive people to be highly innovative. But remember, we looked at Dan Ariely's experimental research, where he showed that at times high financial incentives can actually cause people stress and cause them to worry so much about achieving the incentives that it actually diminishes their productivity and perhaps their creativity. So we want a work environment where creativity is valued, but we can't get there through money alone and through financial incentives. Amabile argues that people want an opportunity to deeply engage in their work and make real progress. They want meaningful work. They want to be held accountable for their work. They want to be given responsibility and autonomy for what they're working on. They want a chance to stretch their skills, to go beyond the normal day-to-day, and to take some of the capabilities that they've developed over time, the expertise, and apply it in a novel situation on a novel and challenging problem. Challenge, autonomy, and meaningful work, all things we talked about with regard to intrinsic motivation. They are critical for creativity as well. We can also talk about the fact that some people believe, myth number 3, that time pressure fuels creativity. That when we're under the gun, that sometimes that allows us to be boldly innovative. And while that may be true, we can all think of a situation where we had a crisis at work or we had a strict deadline and we were able to really flourish and come up with an amazing solution. We all have those sort of hero stories, often about ourselves, that we love to tell. But in fact, overall, when you look across many people and many companies and industries, Amabile found that the results show that time pressure actually can have a stifling effect. She argued that creativity requires what she calls an incubation period. That you have to actually immerse yourself in a problem before great ideas can emerge. If you're truly doing something breakthrough, it takes a while to sort of soak yourself in the issues, particularly if the problem is highly complex and multidisciplinary. And deadlines often bring distractions and stress. And those distractions can actually divert you from the focus required to immerse yourself well in that incubation period, to actually gain the insight and understanding required to have a breakthrough thought or insight. And stress is something that can really build over time if we're in an environment where constantly we're faced with strict deadlines and time pressure and asked to be innovative. Myth number 4, fear forces breakthroughs. That a major threat can actually spur people to innovative action. And she argues that, this is perpetuated at times by the notion, for example, people talk about creative writers and artists, wonderful actors and actresses and authors and the like, and they're portrayed sometimes, some of them, as these depressed, sort of lonely souls who have lots of fear and sadness in their lives, and yet they're so creative. And so this popular myth has emerged that fear and sadness and the like somehow can spur creativity. She actually argues that overall, when you look across many people in many different work environments and industries, in fact, happiness breeds creativity, and it's a virtuous cycle. Creativity and the ability to come up with new ideas and have them be meaningful to others then makes us happier. This wonderful virtuous cycle tends to be more the norm than the notion that threats or fear can somehow drive us to be creative. Myth number 5, that competition is better than collaboration when it comes to creativity. The myth is that if we can get people competing against others in the organization, that the best ideas will emerge and survive, a sort of Darwinian view of how we can drive creativity. And certainly a little bit of competitive juice flowing within an organization, that's a good thing. We certainly want constructive debate and give and take, and we like people trying to outdo one another to some extent. But more and more, creativity is actually about being able to collaborate with others. We cannot invent alone, as we'll discuss later in this lecture. And so we need to be able to share with others, share information, share ideas, and synthesize and integrate ideas across our silos. And so too much competition, she argues, actually stifles creativity, because creativity requires us, in many cases now, not to go at it alone, but to work with others. A lack of information sharing, she argues, is one of the critical things that happens if we overdo the competitive element within our organizations. That people begin to hoard information because information is power. And without that sharing, we can't get those breakthrough insights. Myth 6, a streamlined organization is a creative one. Amabile refers to a letter written to shareholders in 1994 by a major U.S. software company, in which this CEO wrote that a downsizing such as this one is always difficult for employees, but out of tough times can come strength, creativity, and teamwork. The notion that if we streamline and then we go through tough times and adversity, out of it comes wonderful new insights. Well, the point, though, she makes is that sometimes downsizings and repeated downsizings within organizations can actually cause people to get discouraged, and creativity suffers. In fact, she argues that lots of times in the midst of these downsizing, we get lots of fear and doubt, lots of people engaging in rumor spreading because they're worried about who's going to be pushed out of the organization and when, and that distracts from the hard work of creativity. The fear of the unknown can be problematic. So let's move on to talk about collaboration, because just as we talked about with regard to the broader issue of leadership, creativity too is not simply the task of the lone genius in many instances. The inventor working alone in that moment of effortless brilliance, says James Dyson, that's not the way it works. So let's take a look at one famous case of collaboration. A historical case, the invention of the airplane, the Wright brothers. December 17th of 1903, Orville Wright took off on a North Carolina beach in his plane with its 12-horsepower engine. He and his brother Wilbur made 4 flights in total that day. The longest was 852 feet, 59 seconds. Yet, what an amazing breakthrough. It changed the world. Who were the Wright brothers? Well, they were bike mechanics from the state of Ohio. How did they accomplish this amazing feat before well-funded leading scientists at major corporations could actually figure out how to fly a plane? Well, Wilbur Wright has written that even as little children, he and his brother were constantly playing together, working together, and exploring together, and thinking together. That they would share their toys and play with them. They would talk about their dreams and aspirations all the time. They were very close as siblings. And these conversations were meaningful. They weren't just about the usual conversations that kids have, but about what they wanted to do with their lives. They kept detailed diaries, the Wright brothers did, as they went about inventing the plane and being able to fly it. And what's interesting, as scholars have looked at it, including creativity expert Keith Sawyer, what they found is that this really represented a transformative collaboration, that there was no single moment of insight, but instead a string of ideas seemed to unfold, one spark lighting the next. In fact, they made multiple trips to Kitty Hawk. They were constantly discussing their ideas and refining them, testing out certain notions and then determining whether that hypothesis was correct or not, refining and moving forward. One idea is sort of leading to another. And it was messy at times. Sawyer has written that collaboration drives creativity because innovation always emerges from a series of sparks, never a single flash of insight. Sawyer has talked about 7 key characteristics of effective creative collaboration. He's argued that innovation emerges over time, that people who are collaborating need to engage in deep listening so that then they can build on each other's ideas. At times, even the meaning of each idea isn't quite clear, but it emerges through this discussion and listening. That surprising questions are crucial to creative collaboration. People have to ask unorthodox questions and be willing to embrace them. That it's an inefficient and messy process, it's certainly not linear. And that often creative ideas are emerging from the bottom up, not from people at senior levels in the hierarchy, but from folks who don't have power or status, but who have insights that are useful. Sawyer has talked about, as other scholars have in the past, the notion that collaboration involves some degree of improvisation at times as well, particularly when we're talking about people collaborating together to innovate and be creative. He talks of Bill Russell, the famous Boston Celtic. Bill Russell was an amazing athlete, and he played with the Boston Celtics in the late 50s and the 60s. He won a remarkable 11 National Basketball Association championships in 13 years. He was also an Olympic champion and a 2-time champion in college basketball, one of the greatest team athletes in the history of the world. Russell said something about those great Celtic teams that he led during the 60s. He said every so often a Celtic game would heat up so that it became more than a physical or even mental game and would be magical. That feeling is difficult to describe, and I certainly never talked about it when I was playing. When it happened, I could feel my play rise to a new level. It was almost as if we were playing in slow motion. What is this magical chemistry that Russell is describing? Well, people have talked about it as group flow. And it's this amazing notion, very much this idea Russell talked about where it seems like the game is slowing down around them. And people are engaging in this wonderful improvisation and collaboration as they engage with one another. This notion of flow is this heightened state of consciousness when creative people are performing at a really high level. How do they do it? How do they get to that magical moment of chemistry and improvisation and collaboration? Well, certainly they have to have a clearly defined goal and have to have focus. But they have to embrace tasks with enough of an open-ended perspective that they can actually engage in what's called problem-finding creativity. That is to say, where they can discover new problems to be solved along the way, not just attempt to solve well-defined problems that have been set before them. Let's look at an example of this. And a great example is from 3M Corporation and the emergence of a product that we've all become familiar with, the Post-it note. Well, research scientist Spence Silver was trying to improve tape adhesive at 3M many years ago. And he noticed something unusual about this adhesive, and he tried to find a use for it. Well, colleague Art Fry heard about the adhesive, and Fry sang in a church choir. And he ended up figuring out that the adhesive could be used to create an effective bookmark that wouldn't fall out, and that would help them as they were singing at the church. This is a story of how innovation doesn't always come from a well-defined problem in advance. This is the notion of problem-finding creativity, that essentially they discovered an issue, the notion that pages were falling and people were losing their place in the choir. That emerged after the initial insight about trying to improve tape adhesive. What are some of the other conditions for this magical moment of flow between people or among members of a group? People have to engage in close listening, says Sawyer, and concentrate. They have to have some autonomy over what they're doing. They have to be willing to sacrifice their ego and blend it with others. And they have to work with their team members to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate in the process. They have to communicate well and constantly be trying to push the conversation forward. And they have to be willing to fail, something we've talked about in the past. Now, collaboration doesn't always just occur when we're engaged with another party directly. Sometimes we can see instances where there's almost invisible collaboration, says Sawyer. He points to the example of the invention of the mountain bike. Where did it come from? We all know those wonderful rugged bikes that we can ride on dirt trails or when we go camping or when we're in the mountains. Very different than the road bikes we all remember from the 1960s with thin wheels and heavier frames then, now very light frames those road bikes have. Well, where did the mountain bike come from? No one actually knows exactly how, when, or where it emerged. Different groups were solving different problems, it turns out, and gradually ideas for a new model for bikes emerged. It took time to coalesce. In fact, there was a group of riders in California that were beginning to modify their existing bikes as they took their bikes off onto trails that were not on the road. And then also in Colorado, there were others that were tinkering with bikes as well. And there was this sort of invisible collaboration where people were tinkering, and occasionally some of them would come together at a various race, or they would see each other at a state park or national park and share ideas. And gradually, a new kind of bike emerged. And eventually, it became commercialized and a mass market product that companies embraced. So mountain bikes are a wonderful example that it's not even just a lone genius or a close in-person collaboration, but a collective engaged in such a way that a whole is somehow greater than the sum of the parts. Creativity can happen across groups of people that aren't directly working with one another. So now, having discussed some of the myths about creativity and how collaboration is so crucial, I want to move toward closure in this lecture by talking about several pieces of new research on creativity. Research that is quite thought-provoking, that I think you'll find useful as you think about how to foster creativity in your own work environment. Jennifer Muller, Jack Gonzalo, and Dishan Kandar have written a new provocative paper about creatives and how people perceive them in the workplace. Their finding is that highly creative individuals can sometimes face a penalty when it comes to how others assess their leadership potential. It's a fascinating conclusion. The authors conducted 3 studies that showed that people have a tendency to view creative individuals as having less leadership potential at times. They argued that really, fundamentally, that we have mixed feelings about creative individuals. Muller explains, in addition to visionary and charismatic, people also use words like quirky, unfocused, and nonconformist. The fact is that people don't feel just positively about creative individuals. They feel ambivalent about them. Well, this may be very discouraging for us to hear, but it is the reality that these scholars discovered when they went into organizations and tried to understand how people assess the leadership potential of highly creative individuals. So we may have people in our work environment who are wonderful at coming up with breakthrough insights, but as leaders we need to watch out for them because in fact they may face a penalty. Their quirkiness, their unconventional ways may actually cause them to not be given key leadership opportunities. And in fact, we want some of these folks who have great insight and who can think outside the box to be given new leadership opportunities at times. So we have to watch out that others in the organization, perhaps more conventional thinkers, are not suppressing them in their attempts to advance in their career. It's an interesting insight about the penalties creatives face and the challenge for us as leaders as we try to help those individuals in their careers. A second interesting piece of work that's been done points us toward a potential dark side to creativity. This is a startling new study by Francesca Gino and Dan Ariely. They provide evidence in a new study that suggests that creative individuals might actually be more likely to engage in dishonest behavior. This is a working paper that's begun to circulate and that's been written about on the web and gotten lots of discussion now. The authors have shared it to get reaction, and as you can imagine, they've gotten a lot of reaction. They found in a series of studies that participants with creative personalities actually tend to cheat more. This is really interesting. They found that dispositional creativity is actually a better predictor of unethical behavior than intelligence. And in one of their studies, they primed people to think creatively and then looked to see if they were more likely to behave dishonestly. And in fact, priming them to think creatively did spur more dishonest behavior. And then they showed in another study that people were trying to justify their dishonest behavior, these creatives that were primed in that way. And of course, they knew that some would criticize their study because it was experimental in nature, so they even tried to replicate their findings in a field study in an actual organization and found the same types of effects. This is startling evidence of a potential association between creativity and dishonesty, a dark side to creativity. Now, of course, many people have raised methodological concerns with the study, and we will probably see now a whole new stream of research looking at the issue of whether in any way creativity might lead people to cross the line. I personally think it's wonderful that these individuals are exploring this area because we are likely to learn a great deal now more about the nature of creativity. I'm not endorsing their findings. I think we're looking now for more studies to see if we can confirm what they've found or if we can tease out reasons why this finding might have taken place other than the notion that there's a dark side to creativity. And the last of these three new studies I want to talk about actually is a series of studies, some of which do go back in time, by Dean Simonton. He looked at a very interesting question. He looked at when breakthrough work occurs in the life of a scholar or scientist. His early work showed that in many fields, scholars actually conducted their breakthrough work in their 20s and 30s. This is rather depressing for me now as I have moved out of my 30s and wonder, do I have lots of breakthroughs left in me? Simonton showed, though, that the same issue, the timing of breakthroughs, is not similar in every field. His more recent work has shown that in fields such as physics, scholars perform groundbreaking work in their late 20s. In a number of fields, scholars peak in their 20s and 30s. But not always. He has explained that scientists may peak at an early age in many fields because they're more willing to challenge conventional wisdom and consider novel explanations for phenomena. But he's found that in areas with well-defined theories and principles, such as chess, math, and physics, this young age peaking occurs. But in fields with more ambiguity, where there aren't necessarily well-defined theories and principles, we actually see people coming up with breakthroughs at much later ages as well. What do we conclude from this study? Well, certainly we might remember that we want to seek out novelty as we grow older and combat the natural tendency for us to get wedded to old ideas, theories, and principles, to have these blinders on as we become immersed in the field over time, and maybe we're not willing to be as challenging of the conventional wisdom as we age. So let's conclude this lecture. What have we learned about creativity? We began by understanding that we have to be aware of the tendency of herd behavior among organizations and even within organizations. As leaders, we learned that we have to be able to foster creativity by creating conditions that encourage people to think outside the box. That we not only have to provide incentives, but we have to create an environment that will encourage them to be creative. That creativity doesn't just come from hiring creative types. That was certainly a key conclusion. And that it's not the act of lone genius. That involves collaboration, not just competition. And finally, that last conclusion from the Simonton study, beware of the tendency to become entrenched, such that peak productivity and creativity may happen at a young age, and that we become so focused on our existing ideas and mental models that we're not out seeking novelty and challenging conventional wisdom as we grow older. We have to focus hard on wiping the slate clean from time to time and being able to look at the same phenomenon from a fresh perspective.